for that introduction. So I'm Averil Coxhead from Victoria University of Wellington, from New Zealand. I bring greetings from Professor Paul Nation. Some of you might know him. I was talking to him last week and he has very strong associations with Thailand and was delighted to hear that I was coming to see you here today. So thank you very much to the organising committee. I think the conference is going particularly well and I've certainly been enjoying the presentations that I've been to. So I need to just give you a quiet introduction to my voice because I am a New Zealand speaker of English. So you'll hear that there's a little bit of an accent, not much, but there is a bit of an accent. Another thing you need to notice is that I've got some pictures on the slides for you today. They're mostly of different places in New Zealand that are particularly important to me. So when you get tired of the voice and looking at the space, you can look at the pictures. Okay. So this is Mount Taranaki, and this is where I was born. So Mount Taranaki stands out away from other mountains, and it is also by the sea. So it's a spectacular place. And this is taken from the farm where I grew up and where I was born. Okay, so my job today is to talk about research and practice in vocabulary for academic and specific purposes. And you need to know a couple of things. First thing, I'm the baby of 7 children. That means that things go quite quickly and quite loudly, right? So be prepared. Second thing, this is going to be an interactive session. So I'm going to give you jobs to do, and I'm going to expect you to talk to people. I see you're not talking to people. There's no vanilla ice cream for you at the end of the talk. Okay. All right. So I've organised what I'm going to be talking about today, and here's how it's going to go, I hope. First of all, some background on vocabulary and academic for specific purposes, just some key concepts to think about. And then I'm going to talk about 3 different studies. The first one is about secondary school context, and I'm going to be looking at vocabulary and teacher talk and learners' lexical knowledge. And that's from a study that I've recently published in TESOL Quarterly, which is based in international school. And one of the things that I think is particularly important in terms of research is looking at international schools, because there are millions of learners in international schools throughout the world, including here in Thailand. I'm also going to be talking about spoken vocabulary in university level education. So if you think I'm going to talk about the academic word list, not so much today, but I want to talk about some recent developments in the field. And then just more recently as well, I've been working on trades vocabulary, so specialised vocabulary. And this is a whole different world, believe me. So this is looking at the vocabulary of carpentry and plumbing, for example. Now, you don't need to know a lot about the vocabulary of carpentry and plumbing, but really what I'm talking about here is specialised vocabulary. So if your field is engineering, or your field is medicine, or your field is applied linguistics, that's fine. Think about those things, but I'm going to give you examples from the trades. Does that make sense? Come on, we can do it. Okay. Then I'm going to talk a bit about implications for teaching and learning, course development, and some possible future directions, because I think that's where we're heading, right? That's what we need to be going towards. So, let's get started. Why is vocabulary important? We know that learners who have large vocabulary sizes are usually more proficient than learners with small vocabulary sizes. It's a very nice piece of evidence from the research. And we know, therefore, that having a big vocabulary is key in language learning. Now, Jim Milton, who's based at Swansea University, he says learners need about 3,000 words minimum. But we know from research based in New Zealand that learners need 8,000 to 9,000 word families, and word family is bigger than a word, right? Word families is a word and it's all its cousins and relations, plus proper nouns to reach 98%. Now, 98% is important because what 98% represents is the learner can read without really needing any help. Oh, I've got some help. Never mind, so it must be lucky. It's okay. So in the literature we see researchers talking about 95% coverage. What that means is that if the learners know 95% of the words in a text, then they're going to need a bit of help. If they know 98%, then they already know enough to really get the meaning strongly from the text. That makes sense? We're going to talk about this again soon. Okay, but unfortunately, Houston, we have a bit of a problem. And the problem is we see research with low levels of vocabulary knowledge in English for secondary school and also early university students. For example, in Taiwan, in a study by Webb and Chung. And in Denmark, that might be a bit of a surprise to you, that also studies show low vocabulary sizes in places like Denmark, where people often are seen to have high proficiency in English. Oh, hold on, what, sorry. And also in the international school in Germany that I'm going to talk about. So the key question I've got for you is, how many and what kinds of words do your learners know in English? And then how can you find out? So we've got more and more vocabulary tests happening at the moment. You've got the updated vocabulary levels test, for example, the vocabulary size test, which Paul Nation put together. And if you want to know more about those kinds of tests, take a look at Nation's Learning Vocabulary in Another Language is my suggestion. Okay, now, that's okay. A bit more about EAP. So what do we actually know about vocabulary in English for academic purposes? So one thing we know is that nobody is a native speaker of academic English. It's just not the case. We all have to learn this language. So we don't spend every day talking and reading an academic text and talking about academic concepts and ideas. Most of the time learners do that in our classrooms, and then they go home or they go out onto the street and they talk about all kinds of other things, right? And if you think about somebody who comes and starts talking to you about, you know, the importance of the global economy and start doing serious, heavy academic talk, but actually you don't know them very well, you probably think, maybe I won't have lunch with you. Maybe I'll go and see somebody who's a bit more fun. So there's a real problem here with access to academic texts and ideas, and it could be limited to such things as the texts are too difficult for people to read, and we certainly see that in academic vocabulary written studies. It might be a difference between being in school and not being in school, missing ideas, social factors, and economic factors. There's research in New Zealand which suggests that the difference between being able to read and not being able to read as a native speaker is 25 books in your home. So if you think about your own home, how many books there might be. I moved house a few years ago and I was talking to the movers on the phone. They said, anything unusual about your house? And I thought, 2 people, 2 dogs, 1 cat, no, pretty normal. And then I said, oh, I work at a university. And the man went, books. Okay. Now, one key point that I really need to say is that we might use some of the same vocabulary to talk about everyday things and academic things. These words might not have the same meaning if you're using them in academic texts. So if you think, for example, of the word area in maths or significant in statistics, these words are not the same as if you talk about somebody as your significant other, which means partner, right? I've just been doing, as I said, language of the trades. And you have the word line as a high frequency word in trades in the carpentry area. But line in that area doesn't mean line, like line under a piece of paper. It means something completely different. You line a wall. Right? So learners need to know about these differences in meaning. All right. Now, Paul Nation again. Bibles according to Paul Nation. He talks about academic English as having high, mid, or low frequency vocabulary. So this is something when I look at the academic word list, one of the assumptions I made when I made that list is that learners should know roughly 2,000 words when they come into university study, right? But I've already shown you evidence of learners in academic context who actually don't have the vocabulary that they need in order to take part in academic study. So I think it's important that we've moved on in the field. I need to tell you about the academic word list as well, but I often get emails about it. So if you create a word list, be prepared for many, many emails. Many emails. That's fine. It's good because it means people are asking questions, right? My favorite question was a woman who said, my daughter is 3 years old and I want to teach her academic vocabulary. Do you have any flashcards? Yeah. True story. Okay, another true story about the academic word list is that it contains Greek and Latin roots, about 80%. Now, I think that there's some good news in that. And the good news is that some languages also use Greek and Latin roots, right? So, for example, Romanian, Italian, French, yeah? So there are languages around that have these, they share common roots, right? And the other good news is that word parts usually have a meaning. So So I've got some examples here. Anti, dis, hyper, and macro. You have 5 seconds. Talk to the person next to you. What do they mean? Go. Okay, that's your time up. If you don't know, you need to go and find out. And if your learners don't know, then they need to go and find out. Right?
Very much.
Now, with good news is usually some sort of bad news, right? And the bad news might be that some languages don't share Greek and Latin roots. For example, very good. You get vanilla ice cream at the end of the day. Okay? Another problem could be that sometimes the word part is so closely connected with the root that it's very difficult to tell them apart, right? And so finding the core of a word sometimes can be very hard, like anti-disestablishmentarianism. What? What? Now, if you don't know how many word parts your learners know, there is a word parts test, and you can find it on Dr. Yosuke Sasao's website. And he has it at different levels. So there's an easy one, and a medium-sized one, and a more difficult one. So baby bear, medium-sized bear, mummy bear, daddy bear, basically, what you need to know. Okay, all right, so I've been talking a little bit about basics around vocabulary. So let's get on to a little bit about English for general academic purposes vocabulary. And I've already been to a talk today that really explained this very well. So in general EAP, what you get is words which occur across academic disciplines, right? So they get shared. So this means they're quite general in nature and they're important for all areas. And some examples can be furthermore research and concept, right? Now we know that written academic texts can contain large amounts of general academic vocabulary. And you've got examples from word lists such as the academic word list and the Gardner and Davies list. What we've found out recently is that spoken academic text can carry even more. So the spoken academic word list, which I'll talk to you about soon, covers 90% of spoken academic texts, and there's a lot of high frequency vocabulary in that. So stay with me, we'll get there. All right, so that's the general, right? The opposite of general is going to be specific. So English for specific academic purposes, what we get is words that occur mostly in a particular discipline. So it could be in the sciences or it could be within different fields of the sciences. They're generally more technical than general in nature. So words like photosynthesis, which you don't hear on the street very often, right? They are likely to be content-carrying words, and they're less likely to be known by people who are not in the field. So if we think about plumbers and carpenters, when you hear them talking to each other, they use their own language, right? And if you didn't grow up with somebody who's a plumber or a carpenter, you might stand there and think, I really don't know what they're talking about, this makes me very nervous. But I think the international language of plumbing and carpentry is, if they go, it means it's going to be really expensive. It's very true in the New Zealand context. And we have examples of specific academic word lists. For example, in chemistry and medicine, engineering. Look at those fields. Chemistry, medicine, engineering, very much STEM-based at this time. We've got an example from applied linguistics as well. Now, what I've been doing is giving you a bit of background in terms of the ideas that I think are important for understanding my talk. So hopefully we'll keep hold of those ones, and you didn't have so much lunch that you're asleep by now. But what we're going to do now is go and turn to one of the first of the 3 studies that I want to talk about. So this first study is secondary school context. I'm going to talk about teacher talk first, and then I'm going to talk about the learner's lexical knowledge. And in this study, there are 3 groups. One is native speakers of English, and that's tricky because who's a native speaker, but we tried as best we could. And then we've got non-native speakers, but then we've got another group of non-native speakers. And these guys needed extra help. So they started high school, and when they came in, we tested their vocabulary levels, knowledge, and what we found is actually it was really very poor, so they needed to go into special classrooms to help with their English first. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so they're our non-native speaker EAA. All right, so why should we care about teacher talk? Well, Pauline Gibbons, she's Australian, but that's okay. She says, the talk of teachers and students draws together or bridges the everyday language of students learning through English as a second language and the language associated with the academic registers of school. So you can see this connection between the everyday and the academic. Now, what we did in this study was we recorded teachers, and I will be very grateful to these teachers for a very long time. So we went into their classrooms and we talked to so this was grade 6, so these are 10 and 11-year-old students in Germany, and we had 3 sets of recordings. So we wanted to capture them at the beginning, and at the middle, and at the end of the year, because nobody has enough money that you can record a teacher every day for that long, you know, and maybe they won't be your friend at the end of the study. Now, it's a very small corpus that we developed, and then we tried to look at these 95 and 98%. Now, I'm going to give you a job, if you can see this. So what you've got is EAL, that's English as an Additional Language class, Maths class, and the Science class, and I hope that you can see it. Take a look at the topics that the teachers were talking about, and then have a talk to the person next to you and say, what's your prediction about the vocabulary that we will find when we transcribe the teacher talk? Right? So the EAL class, they were talking about a vocabulary levels test and literature comparison. The Maths class talking about decimals, fractions, percentages and measurements. Science class, they're talking about microscopes and distillation and fossil fuel. What's your prediction? You have half a minute to talk. Go. What do you think is going to happen? Go. What's the vocab going to be? The question is, what's the vocabulary going to be? And now I've got another question for you. How many word families might cover the vocabulary of maths, science, and English as an additional language teacher talk? So what's your prediction? How many word families do students need to know? Go, have a talk. What do you think? Okay, now I'm going to put the data on the screen, and then I want you to talk about it, because you guys are smart, right? So I want you to have a talk about it. So here's your first set of answers. You've got half a minute. Go, have a talk. What does that data tell us? Go. Okay, so there are a couple of really important ideas here. The first is that the 95% has quite a shared amount across the 3 subject areas, so 2,000 to 3,000 word families. Remember Jim Milton at the start? He was saying learners need about 3,000 words. Okay, but then you get to 98% and life gets pretty serious, right? Particularly if you're in the science class. Remember the topics that they're talking about? Distillation, all kinds of crazy, scary stuff, right? So you can see that at the 95%, we've got something which is fairly normal and kind to everybody in the room, and then you start getting into these heavy content areas, and then life changes in terms of the vocabulary. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I'm going to show you some data about high-frequency vocabulary. And high frequency here is the first 1,000 words of nations, BNC quota list, second 1,000 and third 1,000. Now we know the first 1,000 words does most of the work, right? And any text doesn't matter, it does most of the work. So the question is, what about in teacher talk? How much work does the first 1,000 do? How much work does the second 1,000 do? Okay? You right? Yep. Okay. Here's your data. Talk to your people. Go. Oh. First I show you. It's not very fair. Go. You got half a minute. Go. Quick. Okay, folks. Now I think what what this data tells us is that the first 1,000 words is absolutely essential for understanding teacher talk. Right? Now, to me, this doesn't mean teachers are doing a bad job because they're not using highly technical vocabulary. I think they're doing a good job because they're trying to communicate their ideas clearly to the people who are sitting in front of them and working with them in their classes. If the teachers were using lots of low frequency vocabulary, we know from the vocabulary knowledge studies that we're doing, the testing studies, that learners don't understand them. Okay, so I think that this shows that the teachers are doing a good job here. Now, remember about the 95-98%. So remember science, it was about 7,000 word families for 98%. Remember that, okay? Now, we also tested the students on their knowledge of the first 2,000 words of English, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, and academic, right? And we had the three groups. Stay with me, folks, stay with me. We had the three groups: native speakers, non-native speakers, non-native speakers who were puppies who needed some help. Not stupid, just needed some help. It's a big distinction, right? Okay, so I'm going to show you more data, I know, more data. And what I want you to do is to look at the native speakers, where do they score? Non-native speakers, where do they score? And then where does everybody catch up with each other? You with me? Okay, here's the data. And I'm going to give you a whole minute to think about this one. Go. Please talk to your people. Have a chat about it. It's really important to me that you talk about this. Okay, now remember that we said just a little while ago how many word families the learners needed to understand, right? Remember 95%, it was you needed 2,000 word families to get to 95%, right? The native speakers have it very quickly, right? You've got that, they've got the high frequency vocabulary, they're all sweet, straight from grade 8, grade 6, no worries. The non-native speakers who didn't need help, they were fine. They were also good, right? What about the ones who needed the extra help, those extra help puppies? They don't develop full knowledge of the 2,000 until grade 9. So what's happening with the teacher talk and the comprehension of those learners until that point? What's happening to the comprehension of what they are reading until that point if they don't have the knowledge of those very high frequency words? Does that make sense? Scary. Very scary. So hopefully people are helping them. Now we've got the 2,000, first 2,000, then we go to the third 1,000 and they catch up around grade 10, and then the 5,000 catch up around grade 10. Everything seems to happen several years along, right? And then the academic word list, which again is written, it's on written, not spoken. The ENZ, so the ones who have extra help, the extra help puppies, they also catch up around grade 10. So it seems that so the good news is they catch up. That makes me very happy. I'm not worried about the 5,000, I'm worried about the high frequency and I'm worried about the academic stuff. Does it make sense? Okay, so what I've been talking about there is a study in an international school with learners who are just coming into the system. And hopefully what I'm showing you is that if you're testing these guys every year, you get a sense of where they're at. Now, the vocabulary levels test we use often makes people unhappy. The thing I think is okay is that everybody sat the test every year, right? So you can find out how they go, even the native speakers. All right, now, I'm going to move on to the second study. The second study is about spoken English at university level education. And this study is trying to get at more knowledge around the spoken language that our students are hearing in the class. So this is looking, for example, at academic lectures, and what we find here is a little bit scary. So 4,000 word family plus proper nouns. Oh, marginal words is things like oh, ah, you know, not really words, but also sometimes rude words. But academic lectures don't often use rude words, which is good, right? But what we find with the carpenters and the plumbers, oh, they really use them. Okay, so this is the 95%. Now, what do you think is going to be the 98%? How many? It's 8,000 word families plus proper nouns. All right, now that's from a study by Dang and Webb. So the key question here is, how can we help learners to develop the knowledge of spoken academic vocabulary? Because we've got the research already on the written, but what about the spoken side of things? So this is where we're talking about the academic spoken word list, which is part of the introduction. So this is from Dang, Webb and Coxhead, and it was published last year. Once you make a word list, it becomes quite addictive, is what I've found. Now this word list has 1,741 families, so it's actually quite big, I think, for a word list. And it was developed across hard, pure, soft, pure, hard applied, soft applied disciplines. Okay? Now if we were in Denmark, that would be called wet and dry subjects. I don't know what you do in Thailand. So what happened was we had a corpus of 13 million running words of spoken academic English, and this word list covers 90%, around 90%. And then we checked it over another corpus, and it covered roughly the same as well. So that's one way to check out a word list, not the only way. Now, what we did with this list is we said, it's time that we started to take word lists and then to say, if we know about the proficiency level of our students, and we know what words they already know, then we can start tailoring or adapting the word list so that learners can take a test, find out how many words they know, and then they can either keep going on general vocabulary, or if they want to go into academic, they can go into the spoken academic word list at that point. So if they know 2,000, if they know 1,000 words, then we've got a starting point in the academic spoken word list for them. Do you see what I mean? So it depends on the proficiency level of the students where they start. And I've got a slide to show you this, but this room is a little bit hard for it to see, but I'll show you anyway. So potentially, depending on the learner's knowledge, you might get up to 96% coverage of academic spoken English. That's quite powerful. And that's powerful in a way because it takes into account the high frequency words in the way that the academic written word list, which is what I did, didn't do. Okay. Now this is available through the journal Language Learning. Alright. This is what I'm talking about with the learning sequences, and it's hard to see, but basically it says on the left, if your learners know this much and their goals are general, then they go down to the general. If their goals are specific to academic, then they come over to this side and they start on the academic spoken word list. If you go to the article, it shows you very clearly about that. So this is an example of taking a word list and then making it fit more closely to the learners and what the learners already know. Because the really dangerous part is that, for example, students come into a class and they do the first year and they learn a whole lot of words, and then they go into the next class and they learn the same words, and then they go into the next class and they learn the same words. You know, we really need to be talking to each other about what vocabulary goes on in class. Does that make sense? Okay, so I've talked about, just to keep up with everything, I've talked about teacher talk, I've talked about learner knowledge, now I've talked about a word list which is about spoken academic vocabulary, and now I'm going to move on to more recent stuff that I've been doing, which is a third study, and this is on technical vocabulary and trades education. This project is from the Language and Trades Education Project, which we call the Latte Project. So we used to have meetings for latte. But if you're going to make up a name for a project, you might as well make a name up that makes you laugh every time you see it with a latte meeting. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to get you to do, though, is to take a look at some specialised vocabulary, just to see how good you guys are. So your job is to take a look at 4 lists that I'm going to show you, and I want you to figure out what the subject area is related to each of those lists. So you ready? You've got 2 minutes to do this. Go. What's the subject area? Go. Okay, are you ready? Now, one of these is architecture. Which one? One of these is health vocabulary from middle school. Which one? One of these is plumbing. Which one? And one of these is law. Which one? Oh, you're so good. You're so good. So, plumbing is from a study that I published this year. Architecture is from a study in Spain of learners who were Spanish learning architecture vocabulary. Movies and TV programs is a really fascinating study, and that was looking at what vocabulary can learners learn if they're watching legal programs or legal movies, right? And the answer was, it depends. It depends if the movie was happening in the courtroom, or if it was the romantic story that also goes with the movie. So it depended on what was happening, what the action was. And then the last one is middle school vocabulary list. This is some work that I published 2 years ago, I think. And so what we have there is middle school vocabulary lists for, I never remember, health, science, social sciences, maths, and the other one. Okay, good. Now, so I want to talk about the trades work. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because I think that there are some ideas here that I'm going to talk about which actually relate to learners who are learning language for specific purposes in general. So we interviewed the learners at a university, at a polytechnic in New Zealand. So that's where you go to school to do trades work, right? And here's what the builder said to us, the tutor. He said, builders have their own sort of language. He's a tutor, so I try to get the guys to talk to me in that sort of language, similar language. You know, the size of the nails, the size of the timber, the grade of the timber, the treatment of the timber. Right? So his whole idea is that we start to talk this language, and it's particularly important because if you can't talk the language, you can't walk the walk and you can't talk the talk. You have to sound like a builder, you have to dress like a builder, right? In order to be part of the field, part of the group. Now, what I think is important about specialised vocabulary is a couple of key points. So one is that you get a narrow range. So in carpentry, for example, you get some words that are shared, you get many words which are not shared. For example, one word that example is shared is stud, but that has a very different meaning. It depends on the context. Now again, specialised vocabulary can be high frequency, middle frequency, or low frequency. And what we've found is that it's likely to be a substantial amount of the text. So Chung and Nation found that 30% of an anatomy text was technical. That's really high, right? That's 1 word in 3. And then 20% of an applied linguistics text. So one of the things I've been doing in this work, the current work, is I've been looking at the spoken language of the trades as well as the written language of the trades, because it's time to understand more about that. All right, now, this language can also be difficult to define. Now, I'm not sure if you can see, but I've got some examples of some words there. I'll read them out to you so that you can see whether or not you know these words or not. You ready? Roof. Is that a technical word? In my study, yes. Foundation. Stud. Know that one. What about dwang? It's a technical word. And interestingly, in New Zealand, we have 2 big islands, right? In the North Island, we use dwang, and in the South Island, we use nog. We asked the builders, we said, why do you use nog in the South Island, dwang in the North Island? They said, oh, because dwang sounds Australian, so we use the word nog. Regional variation in carpentry vocabulary. What? Okay. H1 and H1.2, these are both technical terms. One is a piece of wood of a particular size, and the other one is the Building Act. It's the legal document for building in New Zealand. So it's important people know the difference between those things, you know. Pass me the H.1. Is it a document or is it a piece of wood? Get it wrong, then you clearly don't belong here, you know. Okay, and then other examples in medicine include clinical and Parkinson's. You have proper nouns there, for example. Word like fault is also technical. So you can see that these kinds of words, if you even highly proficient users of English as a second language, and a lot of native speakers who don't know anything about these fields, they might not know what these words mean. So I learned the word cam belt in my car because my cam belt in my car died. And what that means is very expensive. So I learned the word, right? It's a very important lesson. All right, now, I've been building more word lists, and I developed a word list of carpentry. And there are, I'm sorry to say, over 1,400 words. Now, these are not families, guys. These are words. And the reason for that is because in a word family, some words might be technical, and some words will not be technical. So we had to go for the individual words. And we've developed frequency-based sublists. And what we also found is there are very common technical abbreviations, and there are common proper nouns. So we've included all of those in the lists for you as well. We've got them in plumbing, we've got them in welding, all kinds of different trades, and hopefully soon we'll have a website available. Lawrence Anthony's been working with me on that, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to give it to you for Christmas. Okay. Now, here you have the 10 most frequent types on the left for carpentry, and the 10 least frequent technical words on the right. I want you to have a quick chat to the people next to you to say which ones of those do you recognise and which ones do you think, I don't know. Go. 10 seconds, quick. Get into it. Do you know them? Do you know them? There's all this vocabulary that I don't know, and who should teach it, and the specialist teachers are saying you should teach it because you're the English teacher, and my answer to this is everybody should do it because it's our job, right? But it's tricky because these might be words that you've never seen. Native speakers or non-native speakers, you haven't seen them because mum or dad wasn't a carpenter. You didn't talk about it around your kitchen table, you know? Until something costs you a lot of money, you don't learn these things, okay? Now, I've got some abbreviations for you. You try. What do you think? Okay, we'll take you out of your misery. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Okay, so think about our learners. Think about our learners. If they come in and they don't know anything about cars and they want to be an automotive engineer, it's a big job. If they come in and they already love cars and they really enjoy working on them, and the more they know about the cars, the more they will know this kind of vocabulary, right? The more you know about building, the better carpentry vocabulary learner you will be. All right? Now, one of my colleagues at Massey University, not Massey, my accent's a bit messy. What my colleague Gillian Skirm found is she interviewed learners who were coming from China, studying their Bachelor of Business Communication, I think, or business studies. So Chinese, young Chinese, mostly boys coming in to study in a New Zealand university, and they were starting their business studies. So she interviewed them, and she interviewed them right through their studies. And one common thing that she found with all of these people was that when they came, they were very clear that they understood the vocabulary of their area because they had already done a lot of study in China, right? So they saw their main job in their first year at Massey University was to take the knowledge that they had in Chinese and learn the English that went with that, because they understood the concepts, they just didn't have the language. Does that make sense? What they found in their last year, and then when they went back to China to start work, was that they understood all of this, they had all this language in English, but they didn't have it in Chinese. So they went back to their workplaces and back to their families, and these guys are saying, how come you don't know that word? It's like, oh, I know it in English, but what is it in my first language? I don't have any idea. Interesting, isn't it, to develop that expertise? Okay, now, I'm not telling you about this stuff because I want you to go home and say, oh, the technical abbreviation of EPDM is, right? I want you to think about the nature of technical vocabulary in English, and I'm going to show you a final bit of data so you can breathe out now. Now, Paul Nation and Teresa Chung found 30% of the texts were technical, written text. What I found in this study was that the technical word list covers 36%. So that's really high. Now, why is that? Well, because it's developed from the same corpora that I was using, okay. But then when we looked at the spoken corpus, it covers 10%. I think this is particularly important. The reason why I think this is important is that because when you learn to be a plumber, or when you learn to be a carpenter, you learn it through talking. It's a very oral-based way of learning. So the tutor shows you something and talks you through it, and then you do it and you work with your friends. And often these learners have never seen these words written down. And some of these words are really technical. You've seen them, right? So the tricky thing is they learn through speaking and listening, but look at when they start to read, it's much more technical. So one of the things I learned in this study is that I should have a lot more respect for the people who study to be a plumber or study to be a carpenter, because they need a lot of knowledge in order to do their job, right? Because they're experts at what they do. Now, in a comparison, the academic written corpus was around 10%. That's interesting because that's a lot of high frequency vocabulary that's overlapping. In fiction, there's really not much carpentry vocabulary in fiction. It's good news. Okay, it's good. Now, I'm going to finish up with a couple of implications, things I want us to talk about. I believe that this image shows you how I believe about Paul Nation. All right. So building vocabulary knowledge is absolutely crucial. And Paul talks about the 4 strands. And he says learners need meaning-focused input. They need lots of reading, lots and lots of listening. And they have to be focused on the meaning of the texts. The opposite of input is very good. So they need to be doing lots of speaking and lots of writing as well, to again get that workload up, get it high. They also need fluency practice. And in fluency practice, the important thing is everything is known, right? You're not doing anything new. You're just working again with all of that old language. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember the phone number from when I was 5 years old. My telephone number was 8330. Right? Why do I still remember that? It's old knowledge, and it sits inside me for a long time. New knowledge, we forget very easily. But if we repeat it and we keep working on it, we meet it in input, we meet it in the output, we try and use it, we use fluency practice, then it starts to become old knowledge. Does that make sense? So never be afraid to do something twice in the classroom, please. And then the last one is language-focused learning. And I think this is where a lot of teachers do a lot of work. But it's a problem because actually the learners need to be doing quite a bit of work as well, right, with the input and the output. So the idea with language-focused learning, according to Paul, is that they're learning more about how the words are written, how the words are pronounced, what words occur together, what about their grammatical nature, and what about their word families and so on. Now the key question that I've got for you is, Nation says that we should spend 25% of our time on each strand. 25%, right? So here's your question. How much time do you spend on those strands? You've got 1 minute to talk. Quick, because we're running out of time. Go. What about you? Go. Going, okay, where's the output, where's the input, where's the fluency, where's the language focused learning? Just write it in and keep an eye on it, just see. Or if you have learners that need much more of one strand than the other strands, then yes, okay, put a bit more in there. But I think keep an eye on the strands, because I think it's a very important way of thinking about our classrooms. All right, now, very fast now. Academic vocabulary implications. The stuff I need you to think about is that academic vocabulary can be high, mid, or low frequency words, right? There are many more high-frequency words in academic spoken English than in academic written English at secondary and at university level. So it's all full of high-frequency vocabulary, and that's good. That means people are communicating with each other, trying to use language that learners understand. But we know that learners don't have such high levels of language, of vocabulary, so we need to work with that, right? Academic spoken English isn't full of technical words, so you should take a look at the academic spoken word list. Oh, sorry, I'm not caught up yet. And then learners need to aim for high levels of frequency with high frequency words, especially that first 1,000 words, absolutely key to what you're doing. So all the graded readers that you see out there, all of the easy reading, ER Central, Extensive Reading Central, all of that is very important. All right. What about technical vocabulary? What you've found, what you've seen here is that in written carpentry text, technical vocabulary represents more than 1 word in 3. And in spoken carpentry text, it's more like 1 word in 10. Again, these words can be high, medium, or low frequency words, depends on the subject. And we can't assume that learners know the technical meanings of high frequency general words like stud, plain, and but. And remember, abbreviations and proper nouns can also be technical, so they need to know, right? If it's Parkinson, is this Dr. Parkinson who works in the hospital, or is this Parkinson's, the disease that we're talking about? Now, future research. This is the stuff I'm really keen to see more about. I want to know more about academic and technical vocabulary in your contexts. So, what about your learners? What do they know? We know very little about what learners know about technical vocabulary. We know very little about the size of a technical vocabulary. We've now got some word lists, but they're just the start. So we need to look at things like vocabulary knowledge as well. Vocabulary knowledge over time. How does your vocabulary grow? Different learners, different levels, different first languages. I've just started working in Tongan and in Danish, so I'm keen to see more of this work coming through in different languages. We need to know more about the academic, we need to know more about the special purposes, and I'm desperate to find out more about course materials, about how courses are being designed. Do the 4 strands work? Do people use word lists? Do they hate word lists? When they use them, do they use them well? Or do they use them badly? Do they need more help with that? So I've been talking about research and practice and vocabulary for academic and specific purposes. You've all stayed awake. I'm very proud of you. Here's a bird in New Zealand that I'd love to tell you a story about, but we don't have time. Do we have time? Can I tell you about this bird? This bird is endangered, and there are very good reasons why this bird is endangered. So first thing, every 2 years there is a tree that grows fruit. When the tree is in fruit, the birds start getting interested in each other. 2 years. It's a long time, right, before you can make baby birds. Okay, the other thing is they live in the mountains and the fjords like Norway. So these are very difficult places for birds to live. These birds are big, they're heavy, they're like me, they don't fly. So they have to walk everywhere, up and down hills. So every 2 years, the female bird goes, hey, how about it? And the male bird goes, where are you? She goes, over here. He goes, oh, okay. Still there? Yep. Okay. How about now? Oh, no more fruit on the tree. Okay, forget it. Another 2 years. Story of New Zealand. All right, okay, so this is New Zealand. This is where I'm from. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that you've got some ideas to take home with you, and I hope you've got some questions. I'm still here for the rest of the day. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. I want to invite up